Good morning, everyone. My name is Jiang Wu. I'm the director of Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Arizona. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Elizabeth Sharf, and she is an expert of East Asian portraiture, and especially the Ōbaku abbots. And today, she's going to give us a talk actually in the afternoon, but we have this time to have an interview. And Dr. Elizabeth Sharf graduated from the University of Michigan and got her degree in East Asian art. And also she's a co-author with Robert Sharf, The Living Images and Japanese Buddhist Icon in Context. Yeah. And she's also one of the curators for our online exhibition celebrating the 350th death anniversary of Zen Master Yinyuan Longqi, or Ingen Ryūki in Japanese. And today we're very happy to have Dr. Elizabeth Sharf with us. And in the beginning of the interview, we always ask our guests their experience, their research. So can you introduce us a little bit about your research and your career?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Well, I do want to start by saying thank you because you actually got me back into Ōbaku material by asking me to help with this website. So I did a dissertation already, decades ago now, in the I think I finished in the early 90s, 1990s, on portraits of Ōbaku Zen abbots. And it was a wonderful experience. But when I finished it, I did an article from the dissertation, and then I really didn't continue my work on Ōbaku at that time. I think of myself more as a generalist, and so I've done exhibitions as a guest curator in California at the Clark Center in Hanford, California, and at the Berkeley Art Museum, always on Japanese art collections in general. And I'm also now lately I'm interested in eco-art history and developing an exhibition about elephants with a conservation message. So so when you came to me to invite me to join your group, I was really glad I still had all my materials. And I'm very grateful because I love this material. And so now I think I will continue to do more work that I might have done when I finished my dissertation. But I didn't. And I was thinking about it. And I think it's because when I was working on Ōbaku portraits, they were isolated from Ōbaku culture. Of course, I was dealing with it as a context, but I myself wasn't looking at works of art in the Ōbaku cultural sphere, like calligraphy or paintings of Buddhist deities, sculpture, architecture. So it was just the portraits, and I felt, well, what would I do next? So I kind of stalled. But anyway, so that's just in general where I'm at now with my research. Yeah. Yes.
No, but you start your career with the Ōbaku painting, portraiture studies, and I benefit a lot from your scholarship. And you have been doing works still foundational for later younger generations to work on this. And because you focus on the Ōbaku finger portraiture, and what's your general opinion about this group of art objects? And they seem to constitute a unique legacy in both Chinese and Japanese art history.
Yes. Well, so I have a long answer, and I guess what I'd like to do is say that to just give you a history of how I came to study Ōbaku portraits to begin with. So I actually went to Japan on a dissertation fellowship to study the figure paintings, so the images of Buddhist deities or monks or ordinary people by Ike Taiga, who was an 18th century Japanese painter and calligrapher. And Taiga in Japan is very famous. He's not so well known out in the world, but probably with Sesshu, who's a medieval Japanese landscapist, Taiga is the most famous Japanese painter. So I actually, as a graduate student, I decided I would do a dissertation on a famous Japanese painter. And because some people had worked on his landscapes and others on his calligraphy, and I was interested in, I've always been interested in Buddhist images. I saw what he did in terms of Buddhist imagery, figure paintings, like arhats and Avalokiteshvara or Kannon, and ordinary Chinese sages too, outside of the Buddhist fold. So I wanted to focus on his figure paintings. And so I went to Japan on a fellowship and I researched it for my dissertation for a year and a half. And then my advisor, Cal French, fell ill. And he wrote me a letter. It was his last letter to me. And he thought I should change my topic. Because he thought there's too many people in Taiga, you know. And the thing is, I can't remember if he suggested that I do Ōbaku portraits or if I did for myself. Because through Taiga, I knew about them. So that's the main point. Taiga lived in the 18th century. So he was born like at the 50th anniversary of Ingen's death. So we have the celebration of Ingen, the 350th anniversary of his death. And so 50 years after he dies, in the 18th century, Taiga is born. And he lives just in the middle of he lives till he's 50. He dies on the first 100th anniversary of Ingen's death, just after that. So he's not in Ingen's time, but by then, Ōbaku had been such a presence in Japan, and such, you know, and Mampukuji had been established, and everybody was influenced by Ōbaku culture. So Taiga, who was just a humble son of a farmer, and his father died young, but he was a prodigy with calligraphy. So he actually went to Mampukuji when he was very young and performed calligraphy in front of the then Mampukuji abbot. And we still have some of his early calligraphy. It's still extant. And then shortly, several years, maybe 3 years before he died, he has maintained this relationship with Mampukuji. And he's painted the wall paintings in the abbots' quarters, the eastern abbots' quarters. At Mampukuji, there are 2 abbots' residences, and the eastern one, and what survives are these incredible wall paintings series depicting the 500 arhats. And this is a very famous work of Taiga's. And now we think it was painted really on the 100th anniversary of Ingen's death. So it's just really fascinating. I love all these connections. But so I had already, through Taiga, known that I needed to know about Mampukuji and Ōbaku art and what Taiga had seen and what was there. And for example, the Ōbaku patriarchs, the abbots, had brought, in the prior century when they first came, had brought works of Chinese art. They brought hand scrolls and regular hanging scrolls and, woodblock printed books and albums, and of course, all the ritual paraphernalia. But he had copied, to do the 500 arhats, he had copied a hand scroll that was purported to be a 14th century Chinese hand scroll that Ingen treasured. So it's very poignant to me to think that, he probably revered Ingen. Of course, he never met him, being in the next century, but that he, was commissioned to redo the wall paintings in the abbot's quarters on the 100th anniversary of Ingen's death. And he's using as a model one of Ingen's most cherished possessions. So I had to choose a new dissertation topic. I told you it was a long story. So I had to choose a new dissertation topic. And honestly, because it was a while ago, I can't remember if I chose portraits or if Cal French suggested it. But in any case, I was intrigued by them. So I had been looking at what Taiga would have seen in Mampukuji. And I had and Steve Addis, who was another great influence, had done in 1978 this wonderful exhibition on Ōbaku painting and calligraphy, which included several portraits, and including one that we have in our online, two that we have in our online exhibition, one of Ingen and one that is of Dokuryu, which is an incredible portrait in terms of aesthetic quality. So they actually appealed to me, and they sorted out nicely as a group. So if I only had like another half year on my fellowship, I thought I could, certainly do that. And it just opened up the world to me. I can't tell you, it was so amazing to, because then I had to go to Nagasaki to see the 3 early temples there. And of course, visit Mampukuji and meet scholars who had been studying them. So Nishigori Ryosuke had been publishing in the mid-'80s about the Ōbaku portraits. And everything I do is dependent totally on his work, his initial surveys. He's the one that sorted out identities of portraitists and, paintings, and a lot of what I know about, everything I know about Ōbaku portraits comes from him. And then at Mampukuji, my guide was Otsuki Mikio. And Pat Graham, I know she's been here and has mentioned him, and he has passed away, but he was a wonderful, amazing host. Of course, he was an amazing scholar, and his work on Ōbaku culture is comprehensive. There's nothing more comprehensive. So I was very lucky, and he introduced me to scholars in Nagasaki who took me around. And so I was just, amazed. And I think I did have this, whether I chose it or not, I had this real connection with portraiture, because I have continued to study it and to write on it as a generalist in East Asia. I did a bibliography for the Oxford bibliographies. I did it on East Asian Buddhist portraiture, and that also taught me a lot. That's more recent work that I've done. But if I think about it, I think that there's such an amazing, strong tradition of portraiture in Japan. And I was a Japan art historian, not a Chinese art historian. And I knew that there were some incredible masterpieces in paint and sculpture in Japan already. And I was familiar with them. And the Ōbaku paintings were so different. So that was a challenge. It was intriguing to me. And the way people talked about them was something that I think was inadequate. So I think my contribution to the study of Ōbaku portraiture is to make it a little bit more adequate how we talk about them. But I'll take a break. Yeah.
Yes, definitely you did it.
Yes.
With a dissertation, with a lot of publication.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, you mentioned this great Japanese painter, calligrapher, Ikeno Taiga, right? So he is great. But he never met Ingen Yinyuan, but I'm pretty sure he has seen the portraiture, the portraits, right? So that shows the visual image has a very strong power, right, on person. So I look at some of the paintings through our online exhibition as well, portraits. So the Ōbaku portraits seems to have their unique characteristics. So they're usually vivid, right? So in their description, depiction of facial expression, so that'll create some impact, right? Psychological, whatever. So can you tell us more about the actual the portraiture by itself? If you judge by itself, it's portrait. So there are many different artists in portraits. But Ōbaku painters, they have a very special kind of a technique. For example, drawing the lines, adding the shade, for example, to make the pictures more vivid. So there must be very unique artistic techniques involved in their production.
Yes. Well, that's one thing I have published on, and it's another long story, but I'll try to make it a little short. But what people would, when you see an Ōbaku portrait and you're familiar with earlier portraiture in Japan, it, like you say, it's vivid. It stands out. There are bright colors as opposed to muted colors. Also, the portrait subject is portrayed frontally, seated just en face, just the pose is not turned to the side, not a three-quarter view, which was a more, which was traditional for medieval portraits. There are medieval frontal portraits, but they're rare. So, so they look very different. And when you look at them also, not unlike other portraits, the way the face is rendered is so different from the robe and the hands. And so it's almost as though, and this is probably true, it was done in a workshop, and it could be that someone else did the body, and then you bring in the master portraitist to do the face, because the face is so realistically drawn and with careful attention to detail that it gives you an almost visceral feeling that the person is right there, like a photograph. So it differs. Now, yeah, of course, there were in earlier times in Japan, in medieval portraits, you could take a medieval portrait of a Zen abbot and a medieval portrait of an Ōbaku abbot and compare them. And the medieval portrait will not be vivid. It'll be muted, earth tones. It won't be en face. It'll be to the side. And yet there's also this same, there's like the robes are done differently from the face, and the face is very realistic. But what people started to say when they saw how different they were, they're both naturalistic. They're both trying to attain a likeness of the sitter. But with the Ōbaku case, it looked like, aha, here we have evidence of European influence coming in. So, so people would often, the thing that I minded was that was all they would say. That was all they would say. This is European influence. And it neglected to analyze, like Nishigori analyzed, exactly how the shading was done. So if it's a European style chiaroscuro or shading, you always have the light source coming in from a certain side and illuminating, and then you can tell. But with the Ōbaku works, it's not that. It's just volumetric shading. It's just a generalized light falling, and so there's no like shadows that are remarkable. And the line used to depict the nose and the mouth and the ears and the wrinkles is a line. It's not non-linear, which European works are. They're sort of, you smudge the line, and in that way, you create a fictive space, so you can go more into depth. Nonetheless, there could have been European influence because the Jesuits were in China and Japan. And especially this Ōbaku portrait painting tradition comes from South China. It comes from Fujian. It comes from, and we can connect. We know sort of the grandfather of this Ōbaku style. It's Zen Jing. And he worked in the 17th century, and he certainly was exposed to the Jesuits and could have seen any works that they imported. But, and so maybe he was influenced, but he came up with his own way of shading a face and making it vivid, and paying attention to detail in such a careful way, that was his own. And that didn't violate the sort of basic linear structure. Or, the line was still prevalent. So, so what I started to do is just sort of reimagine how Ōbaku portrait paintings could be talked about, and the problem was they were just not Nishigori, but other people, they were just dismissing them, because on the one hand you can say, well, the European painting is privileged. Here we have it's finally seeping in and, into East Asia, and then give Europe all the credit. Or you can say with the later Ōbaku paintings, the shading becomes very marked and it's almost viscerally repellent. So you could say, oh, that's European painting that they misunderstood or something like that. So you can, in any case, you're always sort of highlighting that the tradition of the European pictorial method is the primary one. So I think if we forget about that for a while and then just talk about an internal development, it's much better. But also, people were, well, I think I should just break there and see if you have any questions.
Yeah, of course. I feel it's amazing. I mean, you introduced this topic about the European influence, right? So more specifically, the Jesuits, missionaries. So they were already there in Nagasaki, in China, Machu Picchu, for example. So they brought with them not just Christianity, religion, but also the European civilization, especially in the pictorial, artistic tradition. So I'm pretty sure people already been struck by the vividness of the European painting at that time. So there might be a connection. So you're suggesting here, right? So, but you mentioned the Chinese painter's name, what, called Zeng Jing. So
Yes,
he
Zeng
might
Jing.
be the link, right? So you're suggesting he might be the link between the East Asian portrait tradition and the European tradition.
Yes, yeah. And he really founded a school. And the when Ingen left China for Japan, I'm not sure now if I can even remember, but there's an early portraitist who works in the Zenjing style, who he might have traveled with Ingen on the very ship, or he might have come later. But in any case, he was there before Mampukuji was founded in 1661. So in the late 1650s, he was really a Zenjing follower. And also another, Zhang Qi is another follower who never went to Japan, but he did a portrait of Feiyin, or Hin, so one of the master that Ingen received Dharma transmission from. And that portrait was carried to Japan. And all the other portraits look like that. They maintain the same compositional formula for the abbot seated on a chair facing in the front. And the depiction of the face is carried on. But then it evolves in Japan once the Japanese portraitists have to come in because time is going on, and so they, the earliest Japanese portraitists that we can identify, don't change this Zenjing school style very much. But the later ones do, and then it becomes very, in a way, Japanized, I would say, for sure. But yeah.
During this Japanization process, there's some changes you can identify, or they follow their Chinese masters pretty loyally?
It's interesting because the robe, the body doesn't change. And it's so, in a way, cute because you look at the hands, even in the early ones, the hands are really small. They're not naturalistically in proportion with the head if you're just doing it. So it's almost as there's a stock body and then it's the head. So, but the hands can also, you do see shading on the hands too, of course. So it's very similar to the head, but the shading becomes, the line becomes stronger, so it's even more linear, and the shading becomes darker. So, so it looks aesthetically different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yet, you also get embellishments on the stock body too. You get wonderful embellishments, actually, I should say. Beautifully wrought wooden chairs with beautiful textiles draped over them. And then, of course, and the most obvious thing is when you look at it, it looks like ancestor portraiture. The frontal pose and the stock body and the changing head, and it's very much the case. I think people talk about, I'm not a Zen scholar, but they talk about Zen or Chan as, like ancestor worship. So it's very much, that actually needs to be highlighted more. And if I were to continue working, I would try to learn more about that.
So it becomes even more interesting because we thought this is an art object, portraits, but right now it looks like they have a particular practical use in a monastery. And you said it's about the ancestor worship. and the patriarchs, abbots, they are ancestor for later generations. So the portraiture could be used for ritual purposes, right? So it's a worship, and in the ceremonial events, they will be displayed, right? So receive audience or kind of a ceremonial kind of offerings from the disciples.
Yeah.
Is that a case?
Oh, yes. So that's huge. So I would say that's the other thing that I take a little bit of credit for in terms of the Ōbaku portraits weren't talked about adequately. I don't know if it was from within the Ōbaku fold or without, but they were called in Japanese gazo. So ga meaning paintings, image. Traditionally, earlier medieval portraits of Zen abbots were called chinzo, which is a term only used in the Buddhist fold, and it's a very old term. And there are other terms for portraits in China and Japan. But rarely, they were included in like surveys of Zen portraits. There would always be one Ingen, and so they were chinzo, but they weren't really highly regarded like the surviving medieval chinzo. So I started to look into the prehistory of of abbot portrait painting and learning more about the Japanese thing. And I would read again and again that chinzo were supposed to be certificates of enlightenment that the abbot, who is the portrait subject, gives the portrait of himself to a disciple as a certificate of enlightenment. So this is repeated in a lot of Japanese and English general texts on portrait painting in the medieval period in Japan. So I started to wonder, that doesn't sound right. It just doesn't sound right. But they weren't, occasionally you would find people talking about using the portraits for other general memorial purposes or funerary purposes. But it was pretty much, a standard thing to say, oh, this is a chinzo. It's realistic looking, because the medieval portraits were realistic looking, because the disciple who just got enlightenment wants to stay connected to his abbot master when he's leaving to go be an abbot of another monastery, because he's just received Dharma transmission. So he's given this portrait of his master to take with him and of course to use for memorial services. But what's only emphasized is that this is like a certificate of enlightenment, and it's a whole big thing. So I was working with I was doing my dissertation, and T. Griffith Folk, and my husband, Robert Sharf, I consulted them about this, and they ended up writing, I think, a beautiful article on the meaning and function of Chan portraiture in medieval China. And so just saying there's no evidence for that. So the way that plays into the Ōbaku stuff is that it was just another symbol of the Ōbaku portraitures being kind of rejected because they didn't look like the medieval portraits. So we're not really going to call them chinzo. And also there are too many of them because it's more close to our time. Many more survive. But what Folk and Sharf found out and pointed out was that hundreds were made in the medieval period. And you can go to the text and see that for one abbot, I believe they saw listed like 400, and these portraits of these abbots were taken by traveling evangelists to go around and raise money for the monastery. But the main thing is that the portrait was needed for the funeral of the abbot and it is a substitute for the abbot, and it is an icon too, and when it's displayed, it is offered food and light and verses, and drink, so it's a very highly regarded object. So it's much more interesting, I think. Yeah, and I'm kind of proud that I got them to work on that.
Hey, that's great.
And it was only because I just thought, why aren't these Ōbaku portraits just like the medieval? And it turns out they are. They're just like the medieval, portraits in other Zen schools in Japan.
So this is fascinating. And then now we know a little bit the story about Sharf and the Griffith Folks article.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And that also shows the difference between the early modern Buddhism we're talking about and from early medieval Buddhism. It seems the gap, discontinuity or disruption, whatever, happened in the tradition. And it looks like the early modern Buddhist traditions, including the Buddhist art tradition, they have some interesting origins. It's not a direct kind of descendant from the medieval times.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not that well studied still. So more your students should.
Yeah, the students,
Yeah.
absolutely, young scholars, they should
Yes.
take on the topic.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So I guess that's going to be your future research. You're going to continue some of the themes you highlight in this talk. And
Well, I think the themes that I highlighted is I've already published on. And so what I'm thinking of is, and it's all I'm grateful to you because you initiated this whole project. And I kind of said it earlier. I think I stalled on continuing because I was just with the portraits. It was isolated from the whole context. But when you look at Ōbaku culture, the architecture, the sculpture, the calligraphy, the works of calligraphy, that are also carved on wooden boards and put around the monastery. And then also, of course, I'm always interested in the images of Buddhist deities and legendary figures like the Arhats, both in sculpture and paint. When you look at all of that, and then, of course, with tea, the tea ceremony and the context for hanging scrolls in a tea ceremony room, it's just fascinating. And so in the process of working on this exhibition, I've become both more interested in calligraphy by Ōbaku monks and nuns, but also more confident in looking at it. I think, most people who can't read the scroll because it's in a cursive script or whatever can appreciate the energy that went into creating the work of calligraphy. But on our website, we're trying to actually, provide where we can a transcription and a translation. And it's very comforting to see this relic from the past where somebody has written, something like the one that I worked on actually was, anyway, I won't go into that. But I think it's very comforting to read Buddhist phrases, things that are true about life from the Buddhist point of view, and then to see that it's this scroll survives from so many hundred years ago.
yeah, that's wonderful. So you're going to cover some of the topics in the afternoon tomorrow, right? So,
yes, tomorrow it won't be anything about it won't be a lot of what I said. It's going to be more of a basic how you read a portrait of Ingen, because they're different. There's formal ones and there are informal ones.
Yeah.
And there's ones where he's sitting in a chair, which I've mostly talked about today.
Right.
And then there are others where he's even sitting on a lion. And so he's in the guise of a Buddhist deity. And there's others where he's walking in a landscape. So it's just a survey and tell more about how they can be best appreciated.
That's fascinating. So we're looking forward to that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, is there anything else you want to tell our students?
I guess just please visit the website again and again, and it's going to be updated. And we're very proud of it. And yeah, I think you'll see that the wonderful thing about Ōbaku culture is that it's visually rich and it's deep. And so it would be very rewarding if you're interested in.
Yeah, let me add to this. The website is ingen.arizona.edu. ingen.arizona.edu. Okay, yeah. Thank you very
you're
much,
welcome.
Dr. Elizabeth Sharf. It's our pleasure to host you here. And today you provided such a rich information and insight into a neglected East Asian art tradition. And we're looking forward to your talk tomorrow. And have a nice day here. Enjoy the weather in Tucson.
Oh, we will. Thank you.
So I want to thank our audience as well for following us. And we have a website at cbs.arizona.edu. You can follow us on social media and also our email list. Thank you. Thank you very much.